One of the concerns with the containerized environment is the maturity of the tools that we currently have to use. Now, normally we see a maturity of tools. We saw with, let's again make a comparison with virtual machines, and where you need maturity at the networking level, at data management level, and having all tools that would integrate and give you an easier life in that infrastructure to be able to manage your applications and your data. Are containers already there?
These are well mature. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, they've been around for 10 years and they have a great ecosystem, lots of
Mm-hmm.
open source technology and tools sit in that ecosystem. So it's fairly easy to build and deploy container-based applications because we have a number of good talent pool of people who know how to do it. Obviously, the clouds all support containers in different services they are able to provide, and they provide tools as well. Security systems that are systemically built for containers or bespoke for containers exist. Governance systems, all that stuff exists, which makes them more of a viable technology.
Mm-hmm.
And we just have to look at whether or not we should do it or not. Remember, it's not the question if we can do it. We always can do it. I can do anything with
Sure.
any technology and build anything that's going to work. But whether that's going to be the appropriate configuration for this technology problem. So, where containers had a tendency to go off the rails, and I saw this a number of times in my role as a consultant and kind of watching the industry, is when people don't consider the trade-offs of it. Like I mentioned, there's a
Mm.
container tax, which means I talked about this in my book,
Mm-hmm.
which means you certainly may want to move to containers. There's a good reason for doing that, but you're going to have to pay somebody to recode things, retest things, redeploy
Yes.
things like that. It's not going to provide the portability that you think. If you think that you're going to be able to move from cloud to cloud with very easy without a lot of code changes, you're smoking something. That's just not going to happen the way things
Mm-hmm.
go. And the more you leverage native services on the particular cloud providers you are, the more you're locked into that particular provider. So lots of the benefits of containers have a tendency to be watered down based on the realities of moving to the platforms. So, yeah, having said that, I'm not pushing off containers.
Mm-hmm.
Many systems that I built over the last 10 years have been containerized systems, but you have to use them in special purposes and you have to consider the amount of money that you have to spend to get there. But in some cases, the risk reward there is going to be more toward the reward. And so you're going to make the right decision by leveraging containers. In many cases, you're not. And it's tough when I work on architecture teams. If you're talking about biases, it's not AWS, Microsoft, or Google that I'm running into the majority of the time. It's cloud native technologies and containerization and Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have one trick and you try to use that in every one of your problem domains, use them as solution patterns, you're going to get it wrong a long period of time. So I end up fighting the biases in making people understand and look at the benefits as well as the deficiencies in leveraging any technology, in this case, containers. But there's a huge amount of people out there that are very gung-ho containers. They want to use them each and every time they
Oh,
build
yes.
something. It looks like a nail. Everything looks like a nail if you're a hammer. And I end up with these kind of, because I'm not an advocate for containers or not against containers, but I'm looking at it as a viable solution. You have to get them to look at, the core reasons to leverage it. And sometimes, by the way, those are battles that I lose. If I'm working for a client, in other words, they're paying me as a consultant, they're going to go anywhere they want to go, and they're going to
Mm.
take my advice, and they might not use my advice. But I think that people have to start considering it, and that's why we got into the big money crunch in the last 3 or 4 years with cloud. The cloud bills came in; they were huge. When you look behind the scenes, they were leveraging technology. Containers are an instance of that, but not the only one, where they
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have leveraged the technology in that way. And so they weren't able to provide an efficient platform. They're running on the clouds. They got huge cloud bills.
Yes.
What I use in
Yes.
my book, they're usually getting 2.5 times the amount of money that they thought they were going to be spending. And it is a result of the fact that they didn't ask the tougher questions when they picked the technology. Again, they managed by magazine, they managed by the hype. They went after a certain area, but they figured that was the way to go. And by the way, let's not pick on containers. It's serverless and,
Yeah.
all this other stuff that's there as well. And ended up being the wrong solution. Not that it didn't work. Again, we're getting to this thing that it worked, but it costs 10 times as much as it should have cost. And that's going to be a deficit for the business. That's going to be technical debt that you're going to have to eliminate at some point in time in the future.
Yeah, I find that the confusion and navigating across the complexity of the different licensing schemes of the different cloud providers, that alone we kind of moved on into simplified licenses in the data center, let's say it. And lots of the very big players started to do all-in-one licenses because they recognized it was just amazed that they actually had professionals just managing licenses in the company to make sure that you had all the licenses you need and no fines or anything coming around. I don't find VMware an easy licensee either. But again, I think the question, so two things that I see emerging now, and when I deal directly with the customers, one of them is about containers still. Maybe Europe is a few steps behind the US. Used to be, you could clearly see 2 months now, and then you saw 1 month, and now it's kind of a 6 months lag, or maybe more, I don't know. But you do see the concern about the risk of migrating critical data. But it looks to me that say that in some ways you're going to pay in one way or the other. You will either pay for not modernizing and having the appropriate technology that give you what you want, or you pay to do it. So there is always a cost involved. Something else that I get to see is that there is a tendency to move applications back from the cloud to on-premise. And that is bringing another issue, because one of the sales points of the cloud was you will not need a lot of professionals, IT professionals, to manage your infrastructure. We do it all for you, which of course in your book you clearly say, well, what do you mean you do it all? You still need a lot of knowledge about the tools that you're using, applications that you use. So they seem to think that since I need to know about my applications anyway, why not go back to on-premise? So it kind of, not a total story there, but this is how they see it. What do you think? Do you think there is a possibility that we'll see more and more applications coming back to on-premise?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be a clear focus probably for the next few years. And normally what happened there, and you just frame that very well, as they move their applications normally with lift and shift into the cloud. They didn't do any refactoring, re-engineering, or modernization. And they just kind of let them run, figured out that they were costing way more than we thought, because if they're not localized for the cloud, they're not leveraging cloud resources, they're not running efficiently, and they're going to eat a lot of money because cloud's a utility is going to charge you for the resources you leverage. And if you're using those inefficiently, you're going to get the big bill. Just like if you have a 1950s refrigerator that eats 6 times the power that our regular refrigerators do. And so they looked at it and they go, okay, we got to modernize this thing. How much is that going to cost us? And here comes the consulting companies, or here comes the internal IT group, and they're going to say, well, to modernize a particular system, it's going to take probably a year, and it's going to cost you $10 million. And then they say, okay, well, it's costing us $10 million to modernize the system. It costs us $500,000 to run the thing on premise. It costs us $2 million a year to run it on cloud. And so they just go, let's put it back on premise. And we're not going to modernize it. We're just going to maintain it on premise for as long as it has. So they're making a decision. Yeah. Typically, there's going to be technical debt involved, but they're making the least cost decision that's going to bring the most value back to the business. And that's what I'm seeing 9 times out of 10. If people are kicking cloud to the curb, it's because the cost advantages aren't there that they anticipated being there. And also, what screwed the cloud business plan up is the price of hardware and software has just gone down like crazy. I mean, as far as storage goes, HDD storage, commodity processors, things like that, it's extremely cheap. So they just put it back on premise. And I can't disagree with that, because they're making whatever decision is best for the business. And when you look at it as from a technological point of view, it would have been very cool if they put the stuff on the cloud and containerized it, modernized it, leveraged serverless technology, all the buzzwords, to make that thing, run well, run efficient, and run with the latest technology. But if you're unwilling to pay for that, then it should have never been moved. And I think that people are realizing they made those mistakes, and they're putting the thing back on premise. And that was, by the way, something I was adamant about, 10 years ago when cloud first started, that if we're not willing to localize the systems on the platforms that we're moving into and optimize them, then it's probably something that shouldn't be done. And that's not, other people were talking about lift and shift, mostly the cloud providers. And so they wanted to get as many application workloads as they could in the cloud. And they said, well, it works. Okay, yeah, it works. Just costs a tremendous amount of money. So you want to pay for it? Leave it there. And so that's why you're seeing a retreat back to on-premise now. because those didn't work out the way they thought they were going to work.
But beware of your just move the virtual machine back to on-premise and let's continue to work the way we were working up in the cloud, but use it as an opportunity to look into what do you need, what are the, yes, yeah, what do you actually
They're
need?
just making the decision based on the least cost. That's how businesses, kind of operate. They're not motivated as people think by the coolness of the technology. AI is going to be like this as well. They're making financial decisions based on this is option A, that's going to cost us $10 million versus option B, which is going to cost us a $500,000 a year. We're just going to
Yeah,
go with option B. And because
yeah.
they're going to use that capital and push it someplace else. Now it's a waste because they were up in the cloud for 5 years and it didn't bring the value back that they thought they would for the business. So that needs to be
Mm-hmm.
looked at. Well, who made that decision on that kind of stuff? But I think it's okay to admit you made a mistake and then push it back on premise. Or even, a good out for them is that they didn't know the price of hardware and software would go down as much as it went in the last
Indeed.
10 years. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're basically following the cheaper platforms.
Being that businesses are always looking into how can I cut costs, and I'm not sure how things are in the US, but I could say here in Europe, businesses have not totally recovered from the lockdown and the COVID years. And they're still very reluctant to spend, very aware of risk to a level that freezes them into making decisions. Would you say that open source software and open source everything would be a good choice for those that focus on a on the cutting costs? Would you say open source is maybe something that could, on a short term? Yeah, I know.
Well, it's a viable option, and look at Kubernetes and Docker. I mean, that's an example of open source that's been very successful, and certainly Linux and Red Hat and all those things are viable
Yeah.
platform
Yeah,
options.
for
And
file services, there are some good ones too out there.
right,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And so I never really, when people put open source stuff in front of me, I do consider the cost. The fact of the matter is we're saving money on a license fee. However, there is a cost in the fact that we're going to have to get support. We're going to have to get people
Indeed.
around who are going to be talented enough to run it. And if we're going to have to dig into the code, we have to have the, looking at that. So you have to consider the all-in costs with the
Mm-hmm.
open source stuff. Some people have a tendency to be very religious around open source, and I get read the riot act all the time. That's all we do here. We only run Linux and we only run MySQL and we only run Apache and we only
Yeah,
run,
yeah.
and I say, I get it. I understand why you're moving into the open source stuff, but it's not going to be the right answer each and every time. In fact, you're probably running into some wrong answers if you're using that as your only metric. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason to pay for software and there's a reason not to pay for software. Open source has gone like gangbusters. It's amazing technology there, and I'm
It
always going
is,
to
yeah.
consider it as an architectural option. But just because it's free doesn't mean it's free. And I think I write about that in
No.
my book. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you have to consider the all-in costs, and you can't have a religion around particular technology, whether it's AWS, Microsoft, or Google, open source, Kubernetes, serverless. I mean, there's religious groups out there. It used to be around Oracle as well in the past, that are making biased decisions. Those need to be left out of the equation. You're making the right decision with the right technology for the right reasons, for the right purposes to return the most value back to the business. It sounds like a boring metric, but that's why architects exist. So they're making the tough
Indeed.
decisions,
Yeah.
even non-cool decisions. Heaven help us doing that, where we're defining stacks that are, considered archaic, older, things like that, because that may be the best path for this particular application. And
Mm-hmm.
so the willingness to have an open mind and make the tougher choices and the tougher calls, such as going to a mainframe. That's something you haven't heard a
Yeah,
lot about
seems
in the
to be
last 10 years.
coming back. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be coming back.
Yeah.
But the mainframes of 20 years ago aren't the mainframes of today. And
Indeed.
understanding what the technology is and the purpose of it and what it's able to do is really the
Mm-hmm.
courage that people, need to make. So the best architects out there are the ones that have uh, courage and political will within these organizations to make the right calls. And I think they're being vindicated now that we're seeing these huge architectural mistakes that occurred, just a few
Yeah.
years ago, where
Yeah.
the architects made decisions based on the wrong motivations. And now they're seeing the inefficiencies and the lack of value that's coming back from these systems. So
Mm-hmm.
now we have architecture as a discipline where it is going to be an open minded person, that it's able to consider each and every technology configuration and get to the right outcome. And that's by the way tough to find people who are able to do that. I
It
run into
is.
biases all the time, and I'm just sitting on a panel last month, and I was talking about the advantages and disadvantages of cloud, which there are. Then I was immediately interrupted, but somebody said, how can you not go to cloud? Everything's cloud. We got to go to cloud. Everybody's moving to cloud. Cloud's where the future is, and things like that. That's not helpful
Yeah.
because you're just bringing religion and bias into your decisions when you're trying to take an academic look and taking a comprehensive decision making process at any piece of technology. But they're out there, and they're still out there today, and I'm trying to get everybody thinking differently, but it's getting them to think differently in the fact that it's an advantage for the company, it's an advantage for them as a career path, and it's definitely going to be an advantage for the business having these people around that are able to make the right decisions, the right calls around what technology configuration needs to be leveraged.
Yeah. Do you find that compliance and governance of that data is something that probably will be coming to be a bigger driver than it has been so far? Into the public cloud, let's be honest, you don't really know where it is. Where is your data? Has it been moved? Where you replicating your data to? And solutions for disaster recovery, and in many ways is that flexibility and mobility that they have across, let's say, regions, or across regions and zones, that maybe allows them to keep the cost down, but it doesn't help when you need to have full governance and to comply with a number of different rules and regulations in different countries. I haven't seen as much as I thought I would. It seems that everything is just driven by cost, but especially here in Europe, where there are a lot of regulations and a lot of concern about where is your data. I'm just wondering if in the US there is the same trend.